I'm Peter Suskind, director of the U.S.-Russia-China Trialogue Project at the Stimson Center. Since the middle of the 20th century, relations among the United States, Russia, and China have had an enormous impact on each country separately and on the world as a whole. The purpose of the Trialogue is to better understand this extraordinarily complex and consequential relationship by directly engaging with experts from all three countries. In this show, guests from across the political spectrum and from every corner of the globe share their views in their own voice. While the Stimson Center seeks to provide access to a wide variety of perspectives, it does not endorse any particular position. We leave it to the listeners to judge the validity and value of the views expressed by the guests. My guest today is Curt Mills, Executive Director of the American Conservative magazine. Since its founding in 2002, the American Conservative has been the preeminent platform for anti-interventionist writing on the political right. In some respect, the magazine's position prefigured Trump's own embrace of America First. In addition to running the magazine, Curt has become a prolific and influential commentator on international affairs in his own right. In the conversation that follows, we discuss the history of the magazine and of the country, the extent of American interest and commitments, and the successes and failures of Trump's second term. I hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, man.
So you are the executive director of the American Conservative magazine. Can you tell us a bit about the publication? Who founded the magazine? When? What positions has it taken for or against various issues over time?
Sure. Yeah. So the magazine was founded here in Washington, D.C. in 2002. The basic, quick and dirty is that it was founded by conservatives and friends against the Iraq War. It was anchored around the singular personality at that time of Patrick J. Buchanan, who I think for viewers that are younger or unfamiliar, roughly equivalent to the Tucker Carlson of his day, which is to say the most important conservative journalist in the country, but someone who was resolutely anti-establishment and kind of a thorn in the old guard of the Republican Party. So Buchanan had run for president 3 times in 92, 96, and less, at least relevantly, I would say, in 2000, but he finished 4th in a third party run. Buchanan was the sort of anchoring figure against this war. The other co-founders, in many ways, if Pat was the heart, Scott was the brain. Scott McConnell, the first editor of the publication, and then the Greek writer Taki, who people might be familiar with from his High Life columns at The Spectator. And now, again, at TAC, as of 2026, that was the sort of ruling troika of the early days.
What were Pat Buchanan's reasons for being against the war from the very beginning?
I mean, I think just the obvious tactical risks of the whole thing. I mean, it was dawn of the internet age. It was right after 9/11. Conservative anti-war stuff is probably more mainstream now because ostensibly the President of the United States is one of us. And,
When all this seems obvious in hindsight, but Buchanan's position was extremely unusual at the time.
Yeah, no, I mean, it was basically hated in the broader public, but particularly hated by the elite in Washington. There was a famous article in National Review in the early 2000s by who became the White House speechwriter David Frum, who called the group of people who founded the magazine unpatriotic conservatives. To oppose Iraq was not only a political disagreement, it was a moral failing. And I think you see the seeds of, it had been going on for a while for anyone paying attention, but you see the real nature of the disagreement between what are known as neoconservatives, people who came to the right and came to dominate Republican administrations in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and 2000s, and what might be called the old right, paleoconservative, nationalist, populist, this kind of thing. And there is this tendency on the neocon right that exists to this day for grand moralization, both in foreign affairs, but also in the interpersonal. And so it's not as if our side of things was immune from lobbing rhetorical bombs, but I think that in general, you'll see, I like to think, a less preachy perspective from our magazine historically.
And its principal focus has been foreign policy, and its line has consistently been anti-interventionist, regardless of the issue.
I think that's what we're known for, and I think that's what we do best. But I would say the critique of the Iraq War and the critique of the Bush administration was probably a little more sweeping than that. I would say it was anti-globalization writ large. It might not have used those terms, but if you read, for instance, Buchanan's book, Where the Right Went Wrong, in the early 2000s, you would see, I think, a pretty clear disparagement of the way the country was going on three main vertices. One, foreign policy, but that was merely the tip of the spear. Immigration, enormous, and also laissez-faire or free, quote unquote, international trade. I think it was always of a piece. And this was sort of potentially, it would have been a niche intellectual product, especially because George W. Bush got reelected and a lot of the anti-war and even anti-globalization energy was co-opted by Barack Obama and the Democratic Party in 2008. If it had not been for A, number one, the magazine's survival, but B, there was this little guy called Donald Trump who ran a lot of these ideas only a decade and a half later. And, I'm only aware of two instances when Donald Trump has ever apologized to anyone. The first was to Melania Trump after the Access Hollywood disclosures in autumn of 2016, but he also called Pat Buchanan to apologize for the comments that he had made about him when they were actually fighting over the Reform Party nomination in 2000. So the idea that it's just a cult, Trump is a egomaniac narcissist, not to say that there's 0% truth to any of these things, but the idea that there's no ideas to any of this, that Trump could have just run on literally anything and won. I don't think Donald Trump believes that. I mean, if you look at the kind of rhetoric he used, especially when he was really down and out, so running again for president in late 22, early 23, it really leaned into this non-intervention, nationalist, populist, red meat, anti-immigration, anti-globalization kind of thing. And if there was any intellectual home at all in the world for this, from an American perspective, it was the American conservative, also known as TAC.
So TAC got to America first.
Our haters would say that Charles Lindbergh got to it for anybody, but I think in the 21st century, we were clearly the fulcrum of this.
Why would it be the haters who invoke Lindbergh?
Well,
That's just a proxy for calling you guys Nazis?
Yeah, I mean, I think Lindbergh has a troubled profile in the American imagination at this point. He's kind of like, I think Trump has commented on Lindbergh. He's, in theory, like the kind of guy Trump would really like, central casting, right?
A fantastic flyer.
Yeah, did an act of physical daring. Trump likes athletes and has interesting political opinions, and Trump is not immune to that. I think Lindbergh's advocacy against World War II has marked him out as a bigot or a troubled man in the American post-war imagination. But Lindbergh was the apex celebrity, in some ways the first celebrity, right? I mean, when his child was kidnapped and murdered in the early 30s, it was the O.J. trial or Scott Peterson trial of its day. It was enormous, or it's Savannah Guthrie, kind of thing. And it had happened to like somebody who was a cross between LeBron James and a movie star. And when this person became the anchoring figure for sort of conservative right-wing foreign policy restraint, that was a big deal. And I think there's actually been a historic effort to really demonize his perspective because he's actually such a powerful symbol. And I don't think actually he's said anything that, broadly speaking, that I think is beyond the pale. I think the main optical tactical error he obviously made was going to the Third Reich and being awarded some sort of medal by Hitler in the mid-30s. But of course, the people's conception of Nazi Germany was very different before certainly Kristallnacht or the war. And there were leading figures throughout the American intelligentsia that admired Hitler and admired Mussolini and admired Stalin. So it was not known the extent of the crimes in the 30s by these guys. And of course, especially in the case of Hitler, most of them had not really been committed. It obviously was running an autocracy, but from the surface perspective, it might not have been so different than the Kaiserreich, which of course had a number of admirers in America as well.
Well, since we're on the subject, let's tackle his arguments from 1939.
Well,
you mentioned the post-war imaginary, which makes it almost incomprehensible that one would be against intervention against the greatest evil of our age. But what do you make of the arguments in their own context, and do they resonate for an anti-interventionist position today?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of leery of making polemical arguments about issues that I didn't live through. But the idea...
I'm a historian, so I do only that.
Yes, unlike you, I'm not a trained historian. But I would say the idea that opposition to both world wars, American intervention, the idea that this was fringe stuff is historically inaccurate. They were extremely unpopular, and it was a very close-run thing. Basically, both, and I would note, this is both Democratic presidents who wanted to expand the size of the state, Woodrow Wilson and much more so FDR, basically, in part, lied the Americans into the war. Now, you can argue that was just, that the specter of Hitlerianism or German domination of Europe was just so great that a noble lie was necessary. But
what was the noble lie? Just be specific.
Just that this was clearly in the national interest. It was absolutely necessary for American national interests. I think the argument for that is pretty thin. Right.
You mean that there was actually a threat to the U.S. homeland? Because that was part of the argument.
People disagree on this. I don't think there's a major threat to Iran of the U.S. homeland in 2026. And people disagree very, very passionately about that today. So I don't want to imply that anyone disagrees with me as a liar, but I think it's quite a stretch. I think it relies on this conception of American empire and American responsibility in every corner of the world. Additionally, I think it underrates how porous our system actually is politically to interest groups in the modern age. So I think something was quite different about immigration in the 19th century before mass communication is if you came over here, you were gone. Like the level of connections to Europe, a lot harder in 1870 or 1880 than it was in 1920 or 1930 or 1940. And I think you see, especially as the U.S. becomes an empire in the Spanish-American War, and especially as the U.S. brokers détente with the Brits in the late 19th century, you see us importing a lot of British imperial sicknesses, in my opinion. I mean, like the idea that this empire was necessary for our current power, I think is just historically inaccurate. We are the largest economy in the world. The comparison has been made to modern China today before getting involved in all these foreign policy adventures. We were essentially a hemispheric power, as some people in the administration apparently want to return us to now, and we still have the world's largest GDP. And I would submit that we would probably have the world's largest GDP, or second largest, depending on what you think of China, without running this massive imperial machine.
When did the imperial machine start running? Is it 1898 in the acquisition of a few Spanish colonies, or is it truly World War II and the creation of the national security state?
I think it really starts in the Spanish-American Wars. I mean, a left-wing person would argue that the U.S. was a settler, colonialist, imperial project from the beginning. But I argue, and this is not to just downplay or not acknowledge the obvious brutality in which Native American nations were dealt with. And I think it is appropriate to think of some of these federations as effectively nations. But the model of American expansion, basically from the Jefferson administration on, is annexation, absorption with full rights. And then, obviously that didn't happen for women, that didn't happen for blacks, that didn't happen for a lot of Native American groups. And we fought a civil war over some of these issues. But the model was small r Republican, small d democracy, creating a large country where people who were absorbed, broadly speaking, were given rights. That is fundamentally distinct. And then also, importantly, the land was basically contiguous, right? That is fundamentally different than a naval war of colonial extraction, right? I mean, the Philippines was never a state. There wasn't really any serious momentum, I don't believe. I mean, I'm not a super expert on the Cuban thing, but Cuba was never a state. And even something like Puerto Rico, I think everybody thinks is kind of a benighted example of American statecraft, right? I mean, the Puerto Ricans, as what is it? It's half American, it's half not, as we just saw with the Bad Bunny halftime show, right? The number of American conservatives who sadly don't even know that, or not just conservatives, Americans don't even know that Puerto Rico is in the United States. Well, because in some ways it's not. It doesn't have full rights, right? It's sort of this like silly thing that we gathered, and it's way more British in mode. And so I think that really sets it off. And then at the same time, you see the sort of moralizing, centralizing drives of the progressive era, of which politicians like Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and then later FDR are all part of it. And there is the beginning of what I think is the warfare welfare state. This stuff can feel just like, wow, we should just go back to the 1920s or whatever. Like there's no social safety net, et cetera, et cetera. And I understand these stuff need to be modulated and finessed for the modern world. But I think there was a lot right about actually how the country, not to say that there wasn't opportunities for progress and the country wouldn't continue progressing, but the idea that we needed this state actually, I think, is not very persuasive at all. And the idea that we need to get involved in these wars is not very persuasive at all.
So you are not much older than your magazine.
I'm 12 years older than the magazine, but yeah.
Well, so you came to some degree of self-conscious awareness of the world in the United States about the moment that your magazine was founded. So how did you develop alongside it? When did you come to share the views that your magazine has long trumpeted?
Well, very conveniently for my career, pretty much through the magazine and at the time of the magazine's inception. I've read it since at least the 2004 election, but honestly before. So whenever the 2004 election kicks off, 03 or whatever. And so politics is interesting because like very, very smart people who have all kinds of wealth of information can just disagree on basic fundamental things, right? I saw these making the rounds again. The sort of Robert Kagan, neocon historian extraordinaire person has been on Almond Pour all week, the CNN show. And obviously Robert Kagan knew more about foreign policy and history than a 13-year-old me, but I would submit that a 13-year-old me got the Iraq War right and he got it very, very, very wrong, right? And so there was something about the first blush arguments that seemed just so fundamentally wrong to effectively an adolescent teenager that it has really stuck with me. Not to imply that I haven't changed views on certain things. I think at different times, different things become more salient, maybe different economic approaches or different focuses, different parts of the world. But like, the fundamental view that the U.S. immigration regime has gone into overdrive and is counterproductive, the fundamental view that free trade is kind of a lie, and the fundamental view that these wars, we're not winning them and they're kind of pointless for the U.S. national interest, I've had for 2 decades.
So what makes you, in the magazine by extension, conservative? So of those 3 pillars, I suppose opposition to immigration is the only one that is coded conservative. Your assessment of American empire, critique of free trade is classic left-wing principles as well.
Maybe. I would say I am very comfortable. I'm not sure everybody that we've published and has been in the leadership of the magazine over the years this is more of a me view than a house view, though, obviously increasingly like my view quite matters for a house view, is that I think we have very little in common with what people think of as the modern conservative movement or establishment conservative or conservative Inc. That is William F. Buckley's concoction. It is a fundamentally post-war invention. I think it's not real. I think it's not actually that conservative. When I hear the word conservative, I don't really, to an extent, like labels are only so important, but I fundamentally think that the country is good. The country's founding institutions are good. I'm pro the Constitution. I'm pro the Declaration of Independence. And I'm pro the country's history, heritage, and inheritance. And, as you could tell by what I said in the previous segment, I think the country's gone off the rails for about a century, but certainly since the end of the Cold War. And so, I'm comfortable with that. But yeah, do I have much in common with Mike Pence? No, I do not, proudly.
Is there a sense that the right side of the political spectrum has in some respects taken up the anti-imperialist, taking the reins from the left? That there are obviously distinctions, but where the new left was leading for decades, now it's the new right or whatever else you want to call it that is leading the charge.
There are good left-of people, and we know a lot of them, and it remains to be seen if they will remake the Democratic Party in the future. I think what essentially has happened is ideology and party weren't so neatly aligned in the early 20th century, right? You've got people who, like H.L. Mencken, who by I think any metric is a right-wing libertarian who opposed World War I. And then you have like uber progressive politicians like Hiram Johnson or Robert La Follette, who I believe are both Republicans, but like probably would be Democrat, left-wing Bernie Sanders types today. I don't know, it's counterfactual. And they both opposed the war. But I would submit that the previous anti-war movements, because it was Democratic administrations, were functionally kind of more concentrated on the right. And indeed, the leading politicians that opposed the wars, Orrin Harding famously withdrawing us from the League of Nations, Herbert Hoover in the 30s, I think it coded right. That sort of flipped for a variety of complex reasons in the 60s when the anti-war movement obviously became so closely aligned with the left. And then the Bush family sending us into so many wars in the Middle East in the early 90s and early 2000s made a lot of the anti-war movement very left. And then by then, you had the Vietnam energy, you had the anti-Iraq energy over 2 generations. Barack Obama very much was a beneficiary of that and rolled into power on that in 2008. But I think what's really effectively happened to the Democrats, and this is not my critique, this is actually a left-wing critique within their own ranks, the Democrats have become the party of power and the party of the establishment. I think it's not as clear as it was 3 years ago because the Democrats aren't in charge now. But, broadly speaking, if a Democrat becomes president in 2028, 2029, I mean, we're recording as AOC is giving her foreign policy address in Munich. But I do think there's like all these lines of convergence of establishment interests. Like, for instance, on Russia politics, for instance. The Democrats are going to run against oligarchy, right? And I'm not saying there's nothing there. They're going to run against corruption. I'm not saying there's nothing there. But they're going to link that to foreign policy is my suspicion. I think you've seen Bernie Sanders do this already, Elizabeth Warren more explicitly. And if you're running against oligarchy, then like the obvious like bogeyman example of that are the Russians, right? So like accordingly, if we're going to take it to the oligarchs here home in this conception, then like, our animating foreign policy goal has to be taking it to Moscow again. And it's different motivation, it's different language, it's different seasoning, but like how is it functionally different from Biden Atlanticism? I'm not sure it is.
Right. Well, Matt Duss and a co-author had an essay in Foreign Affairs not too long ago where they proposed this global crusade against kleptocracy, which does not sound fundamentally different from the global crusade against autocracy.
I would be hesitant to see it. I think, and additionally, like, I mean, nothing I wouldn't say to his face and doesn't know, like, I do think, when he was advising Sanders in the late 2010s, Sanders' attack on Russiagate, I think, was like not great. Like, I think Russiagate is extremely unfounded and dangerous and put the seeds for a lot of our modern political maladies. So I am hesitant.
Can you spell that out a bit?
Well, I mean, it was an actual witch hunt. Like there was just very little evidence. And then it was clearly a weaponized crusade against a duly elected president of the United States that just happened to ally with a lot of like icy and liberal Atlanticist goals on foreign policy. I mean, by all means, if Trump was like actually a Manchurian candidate and there was evidence but I mean, the kind of stuff that was printed, there is a lot of flaws in conservative media. I mean, we declined the invitation to report on the Pentagon. I think Hegseth's rules are counterproductive and clownish, but like, it's not as if, and you see this with the Washington Post brouhaha right now, it's not as if like center-left journalism in the late 2010s, which was considered this great model in retrospect, was blameless. I mean, the kind of stuff printed in stuff like New York Magazine by Jonathan Chait it was the liberal equivalent of Glenn Beck's terrifying chalkboard in 2010 on Fox News. It was just crazy stuff. It's not rigorous. There's still like a hesitancy to like apologize for that. And I think it also played in a little bit into how insane the Democrats went on COVID and BLM. Like there's this assumption that the Democrats are actually always more rigorous than the Republicans, where the left is always more rigorous than the right. And the right is for idiots and air days for something like this. I just don't think that it's borne out. Like a lot of the larger mistakes of management of the United States over the last 10 years have been pretty attributable to the left.
And you think that is more about the left as an ideology than the state as a bureaucracy? Because you just said a moment ago that the left has, in some sense, melded with the establishment, so it's hard to tell if it's the left doing something or just the bureaucracy.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's very difficult, and maybe it's just like the thing that I feel more personally impressed by, and I think one should be cognizant of that. But I would say when the left is just making stuff up, it feels really oppressive because the left is still broadly more in control of the American establishment. The right and the Trump administration make up crap all the time, but it doesn't feel like it has this oppressive, totalitarian energy in the same way. I think Trump does have authoritarian impulses in some sense, but he doesn't have totalitarian impulses. So I know that's like a relative defense. There definitely obviously are political prosecutions going on, but like people really slept on the early Biden era stuff. They really declared white domestic terrorism the number one national security threat to the United States. It's just like something that's like totally made up. Of course, like the number of like white extremists in the country is above zero in a country of 330 million people. But like these far right groups are like half federal agents, and the Ku Klux Klan has, I think, seen better days. The idea that these things were like the top threat, I mean, it's a long conversation, but like, that so much of the left wing conception of the world assumes that like we actually still do live in the Harding administration or something like this. It's just the country is not like that. You kind of see it in the Epstein list, and there's obviously like it runs the gamut, but like what is the Epstein list like really? It's kind of a list of Democrats. There's exceptions, obviously, but it's broadly speaking, it's a list of very wealthy, very Ivy League connected Democrats. And the most implicated are the Clintons, who are like obviously the center of this.
Well, I can't pretend to have read the however many million pages, so who's most implicated by what innuendo specifically, I have no idea. But certainly the Clinton angle is much discussed.
Most high profile, most compromised by these disclosures, I think it's fair to say. And that's why they'll be testifying at Congress shortly.
How much of the anti-war energy on the right is attributable to the disproportionate cost they had to pay in actually fighting in the Middle East?
I think it's significant. The military's had recruiting problems for a long time. In the military, since the end of the draft, has become way more of a socioeconomically lopsided thing. And so, frankly, just a lot of people who are in the military today are from white working class, southern, rural, just not terribly wealthy people. There are a ton of people who are of Latino background and Black background who I think, broadly speaking, have a separate story and separate voting patterns, although the Latino thing I think is more ambiguous. But I think it's huge. And there are people that have become, however unevenly, sort of avatars and of this perspective, of this skepticism. And of course, the most famous is the vice president.
Okay, so it's clear that you believe that the U.S. is overextended in all sorts of ways and has gone off the rails, or did go off the rails, over a century ago. And we'll get to a discussion of which regions to retrench from in what order in a moment. But to begin with first principles, how would you define U.S. interests and how far do they extend?
You mean like on a map? It's so hard to do it in this direction because I can just do it in the reverse direction. Like, we shouldn't have bases in Syria. I'm pretty comfortable with that.
Well, I know, but that's why I didn't ask it that way, because we can
Okay,
take the low-hanging fruit in a moment.
Well, but they're not that low-hanging fruit. I mean, as somebody who's been kind of in these policy battles on both reporting and as an activist for 10 years, like, it is just pulling teeth to get out of Syria. It's pulling teeth.
No, I agree. But since you have been engaged in those battles for so long, I think it's sometimes important to take a step back.
I'm sympathetic.
All these restrainers agree that we should get out of Syria, but would probably, if pressed, define American interests differently. So if we were not settled with all this baggage and could start over, employing our means to achieve certain ends, what would those be?
Yeah, so I think if you had to define my own policy preferences, I would say, like, there's the realism and restraint sort of coalition, right? And then in foreign policy MUSAC terms, that I feel like this is like prioritizers versus restrainers. Like, I have become more and more and more on the restraint end of that equation, but I would say that I am not a total restrainer. I think the administration's hemispheric defense is a good idea. I think the idea that the U.S. should throw its weight around in the region is fine, but I am leery of doing that in a way that I think are the imported sicknesses of the war on terror and our colonial failures around the world. So, like, I oppose the Venezuela abduction. We could have gotten everything we wanted by just working with the existing regime. Evidence is that we're getting everything we want by working with the existing regime. So this was a wholly unnecessary risk for the White House to take. And, my view is that the U.S. really only has one peer competitor in the world, and that's China. And so I think that if I'm hawkish on anything, it is China. I think the Russia, Middle East stuff is completely not our business.
What would you do about NATO?
I think we should be moving towards leaving it. It doesn't really serve any purpose. I think it actually is more provocative than protective. And I don't know if President Trump should leave today or tomorrow, but I think we should be sunsetting our involvement in it. And how I don't have firm opinions on how quickly or deliberatively. I think when we set it up, we've been involved in it for nearly 80 years, but I think we should be moving towards leaving, or at least severely limiting its relevance.
Did NATO ever serve a purpose as far as you're concerned?
I'm less convinced of the necessity of the Cold War, as I think maybe it's not a surprise when you've heard my comments on the previous world wars. So not particularly, but if you needed to fight a Cold War, absolutely, it did.
Which means that you are not in favor of future Cold Wars or proxy wars with Russia. And
no.
Leaving NATO over time or abruptly would lessen the chances that we would be involved in conflict with Russia.
It's just very, you asked me hypothetically, because of course you know more than me, like how tight the Russians and Chinese are today, like all the problems of like trying to pull off something like a reverse Kissinger, which is people think is fantasy basically. But like in theory, like
I don't think it's fantasy at all. Russia is very uncomfortable in its current position. So it's not going to become an adversary of China the way that China had already become an enemy of the Soviet Union before Kissinger arrived. But Russia would be very eager to move away.
dressing up my views, which because if you say reverse Kissinger, I feel like you're on a foreign policy podcast. People think you're an imbecile. So in 2026, but yeah, I agree. I don't think it's impossible either, but that's not the felt sense or the consensus. And so I guess I was disguising my actual view, but I don't get the Russia hawk crusade basically at all. I don't get the Iran hawk crusade basically at all. That's not to say that like I fully trust these societies. I don't, but I don't fully trust the British. So like, I really don't trust them, certainly don't trust our great friends in Israel. So like, I mean, like the trust itself is in international relations. It cannot be the only currency or else we're not going to engage with anybody.
Who is more dangerous to the United States? The Russians, the British, or the Israelis?
I think the Russians don't ask for anything. They are obviously doing a war of conquest in Ukraine. They are trying to take territory, granted territory that was theirs when the year I was born. So I think it's a little complex. It's not just like this random war. But, the Russians at least don't ask the U.S. to pay for it. The British and the Israelis particularly do. So that's my answer, which is answer via non-answer.
And when you say that you don't get Iran hawks and Russia hawks,
yeah,
what you mean by that is that neither country seems to pose a substantial threat to the United States, to our physical security, as far as you can tell.
No, even the sort of extreme examples, like the Russians, as far as I'm aware, don't assassinate people inside the United States. The Iranians don't either, even though there's like, very fringe allegations of attempts from maybe people's sectors of their society. And that's obviously downstream of our very adversarial foreign policy towards them. So if that's the amount of blowback we're getting, it's just, even with our current posture, I just think just structurally they don't threaten it. I think a lot of it is the fact that we still live in a gerontocracy, and so much of the anti-Russia, anti-Ukraine thing is just very baby boomer, right? It's just 1979. It's just people who don't understand that Soviet Union doesn't even exist anymore, frankly. Sometimes you get the sense from like some baby boomer Democratic congressmen, like they really think like Putin is just, there's no distinction between him and Brezhnev.
Well, I think Hitler and Stalin are the most frequently invoked comparisons.
He's both Stalin and Hitler or something.
Brezhnev would not provoke such an indignant reaction.
Well, we were hawkish towards Brezhnev, and I've been doing a lot of very bizarre, like Ford and Carter era reading right now. And I actually think the 70s is an underrated time of when we really started messing up. So the early neocons broke the Kissingerian Nixon détente in the Ford administration. And our original posture towards Iran was like basically a kind of traditional WASP establishment versus Brzezinski thing, right? So like Cy Vance resigns over the special force raid that fails Operation Eagle Claw, great name, bad operation.
Also a bit of a zoological misnomer. Eagles, I imagine, have talons, not claws.
Well, I mean, you're not hiring Delta Force for the names, presumably, but it's about the best thing that happened in that operation. But it's very interesting. Like, I mean, like you're seeing it kind of now. I see the Shah, alleged Shah of Iran, Reza Pahlavi, is in Munich saying he wants to be a transitional figure, et cetera. Khamenei said the same thing. The consolidation of power with that kind of edge to it was not a fait accompli. The ambassador to Iran urged Carter to make a deal with Khomeini. Not that it would be kumbaya, the Shah, et cetera, but it would at least like potentially secure neutrality in the region. And it's probably inaccurate to call Brzezinski a neocon. This is Carter's national security official because he opposed the Iraq War, and I think it's more complex, but I think he was kind of a neocon, and Brzezinski led the Hawks in the administration to do the special forces raid that failed, to not do a deal with the Iranian revolutionaries. And I think we're still living with the consequences now, and we see the echoes of it, which is like the idea that we cannot do business with the current ruling government in Iran, and I think that's just obviously true.
What is obviously true?
Obviously not true that we keep the business. I mean, we had a deal with them with Obama, but even if you don't like that deal, there's a better deal on offer now. And so like the whole debate is fake. The Hawks want a debate between war and or complete capitulation, i.e. a surrender deal. And so I just don't think imposing regime change in that part of the world is really in our interest. And then additionally, if we actually care about bringing the society more online, making it more, quote, Western or more like us, I'm not sure we should, but if we did, then I think sanctions, relief, and trade is far more likely to do that peacefully than the force of the gun.
What do you make of Western civilization? It's a national security strategy. It is a popular concept in certain portions of the young right-wing commentariat, is it a meaningful category as far as you're concerned?
I don't think it's a thing, basically. I think Western civilization is a concoction, more or less, similar enough to the Buckleyite conception of modern conservatism. It's newer than people understand, and its ironclad precepts are more artificial than I think generally conceded. And so I don't think that there is, as sometimes is now voguish on the right, I don't think there's like one unified civilization from San Francisco to Jerusalem. I don't think that for most of history, anyone who lived in any of these places would have conceived of themselves like this as part of one fight or one shared culture, anything like that. And I don't think that there's this massive panacea of democracy and liberty inside the castle walls, and outside the castle walls is that we're besieged by Asiatic hordes who hate us for our freedom. I think this is a mixture of Fukuyamaism and Anti-Interventionism, and I reject both views of the universe. I know that they're gigantic intellectuals, and I know that people like to cite them. I think we would have been better off with neither of them on the scene, quite frankly.
Well, forget Fukuyama and Huntington for a second and consider Plato and Molière. What if we like them and I don't know, the Gothic cathedrals spread around Europe? Is that a meananingful imperative in foreign policy?
I like Notre Dame and I like Samarkand. I mean, like, the human beauty is, I don't mean to like come off like kumbaya here. I'm American. I have more in common with France and Uzbekistan, but like the idea that I have something that's fundamental, like I have to endlessly care about defending this sort of like goofy welfare state in Europe or the ethno-nationalist Jewish Pakistan and Israel, I think this is a concocted argument that is actually just sucking this country dry.
What is curious is actually that in the U.S., Western civilization was first formulated as a pillar of national identity and a mandatory course in elite universities in the so-called isolationist period in 1920s and 30s.
Yeah.
So there was a combination of an ideological assimilation of the United States into something that was more or less invented, as you say, as Western civilization, at the same time as the U.S. was avoiding geopolitical entanglement with Europe very decisively. So that doesn't seem to be the bent taken by those who invoke Western civilization now. They seem to assume that it involves some kind of active defense on some front. I suppose more political.
More than defense, like a messianic zeal that like there's some like grand showdown between, I mean, it's weird, right? Because I mean, like Trump represents this sort of obliteration and humiliation of the neocons in all these ways, but there's all these different elements of Trump that seem ripe for co-option in a sort of new neocon way. It's a fine line, right? Like, because if you believe the world is moving back into great powers, then as I think I broadly do, there's a major distinction though by saying, because okay, if you think the world is moving towards great power competition, a la Mark Carney's speech in Davos, but there's like two different roads you could take, which is road number one, that there should be these civilizations, conflicts should be managed through diplomacy, concert of Europe kind of stuff, et cetera, versus two, a showdown. And like that's some of the language I think you still see by Fast's administration. Fast's first term, the first national security strategy was just an all great power competition document. I reject the inevitability of it. I don't think it was inevitable, as we discussed at the top of the program, 115 years ago. And I don't think it's inevitable now. And I think it's just as dangerous as ever. And I do think the Cold War logic of nuclear annihilation still holds.
So what do you make of China then? Because you said that you are not a Russia hawk, not an Iran hawk. If you're a hawk in any regard or in any region, it's East Asia and with respect to China. So is a showdown inevitable, avoidable, and on what plane will we compete?
I think it is avoidable, but I think it is tricky. And I think that any serious appraisal of how the U.S. should use its power, where it will use its power, is like it's not going to just leave East Asia, I don't think. I think it's not worth the risk. But I think the relationship should be actively managed. In some ways, Trump is right to pursue this kind of personalistic diplomacy. I think it's been more successful than the Biden administration approach, which was more procedural and managerial, and I think got us closer to great power conflicts. And then I think China, so far as anyone understands, there's really one decision maker, so the personal element is a big deal. And I think if you had to super macro credit the administration, current administration, for anything, is that, as I think our friend Jan Kavanaugh has observed ad nauseum, we are in an era of actual great power conflict recession. It will all look silly if Xi invades Taiwan tomorrow, we go to war. But like, by all appearances, tensions appear to be cooler than they were in 2022 when the chances of the Russians using a nuclear weapon were assessed by the United States at 50%. And Biden, the president, inadvertently blurted out regime change desires in Moscow and committed to the use of troops in the defense of Taiwan, Formosa, etc. Trump hasn't done anything like that, and I think we've been better for it.
But you don't see the prospect of any kind of deal. Détente is the best case scenario because Trump clearly is hankering after a deal, I imagine, and might have some kind of expectations for the meeting in April.
Yes.
But you think structurally there's no ribbon that can be tied on this?
I think I have attacked a lot of 20th century policy, but I think strategic ambiguity on Taiwan's pretty much worked. You know, it hasn't been absorbed by the PRC. We haven't recognized it. It's been an economically uber productive part of the world. There hasn't been a war. Maybe there's ways it could have been better, but that's pretty good, it seems like. And so my default would be towards preserving that. It's interesting because like the argument, a little less voguish right now, but there's an argument about on the Iran file 4, 5, 6 months ago that argued that negotiations themselves were provocative, right? So on the one hand, the negotiations were good. I'm in favor of a new Iran deal. I'm in favor of solidifying the relationship and formally cooling tensions. But what caused the initial war? Well, the negotiations. It got the Israelis super animated. They darkly, comically intervened to enforce a deadline to a negotiation they weren't party to. So there was some view that like negotiations are just too dangerous. Like we will actually avoid a war if we have this sort of mediocre status quo. Maybe there's something to that logic with U.S.-China, that actually just a lack of explicit framework is actually fairly durable in this weird way. With Iran, it's just, there's no reason the U.S. shouldn't make a deal. The only reason is Israel. Versus China, there's no it's just the actual raw reality.
What's the raw reality?
Well, it's just that they're actually a peer competitor. There isn't some other the Taiwanese.
But what does a peer competitor mean? Because this is just taken for granted. And I understand that China is massive and is threatening the United States in various ways, but competition isn't across the board. We are engaged in mutually beneficial exchange to such an extent that it is almost impossible to disentangle in some areas. So I'm sure we're competing in some areas and even in open conflict in others, but just describe the nature of the competition in a bit more detail.
Sure. And I appreciate you're challenging that. I just think that the reality of the China thing is that I think it is competitive with the United States on a number of fronts. So obviously the economy by different metrics is about as large. Its population is 4 times larger. Its military is larger. It has all these advantages that we don't through their system. We have advantages through our system, but some of their advantages are quick decision-making, non-focus on human rights and international development. And I think all of these things are relevant when you have the scale of something like the modern Chinese state. And I think that when you have two sides, it's to an extent just the nature of things when there are two people that are, or two entities, whatever you want to call it, that are pretty different than each other. And I think, and this is where the West thing is fair. I mean, China is the East. It is very different history. We don't know much about it. Most Americans don't. I think there's naturally going to be some tensions. I think those tensions are manageable. But I think it's a lot different than Iran or Russia, where there's a power imbalance. And the nature of the confrontation to me strikes me as laden with moralism. It just seems like the argument is all about moralism versus the argument on the China stuff is more about power. You could argue that argument is dumb. You could say we could actually just benefit from trading and exchange, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the power reality is there. And then additionally, I think there's some nasty history, right? A lot of people, and I think this is the American leadership is more to blame than Deng Xiaoping, but a lot of people believe that China destroyed the American industrial base and that China destroyed the American working class. And a lot of people, not unfairly, think China shut down the world with COVID. And so there's bad blood. And even if you think tabula rasa, clean slate, et cetera, and I think there's potentially an argument for that, we're not going to bring all those jobs back. We're not going to reverse 2020, et cetera, et cetera. I think a lot of people in the population are naturally disinclined towards China. And that has to be managed.
I agree that there will inevitably be tensions between two entities of this size. The question is what kind and what to do about them and how those tensions compare to real potential or existing threats. And available opportunities. And if it's a range, then that's a very different proposition than what we normally hear, which is taken for granted that there is some kind of extraordinary and perhaps existential conflict already underway or in the offing. And it sounds more convincing frequently because of the absence of moralizing language, at least among the more rational realist types, although there are a lot who say Communist Party of China with a special tone of voice, and that does a lot of work for them. But you say, again, like Chinese economy is as big as the American economy or perhaps larger, but it's also inseparable from it. So they can weaponize rare earths as we can weaponize our own advantages. But it seems both countries have realized that they need to pull back from the brink. There was an attempt at a trade war. There was a Chinese retaliation. And now both sides realize that they don't want to pursue this self-mutilation any farther in hopes of defeating the other.
No disagreement.
You already gave kudos to Trump in a couple respects, but you are one of his most vocal critics on issues such as Iran and Venezuela and others. So we've had a year and a little bit of this administration. Give us a grade in different categories, or I guess a number of grades.
What are the categories?
Basically what you mentioned is the pillars of your magazine.
Sure.
Immigration, protectionist economy, and military intervention. How has he done on those three issues?
I'm not trying to shy from saying I'm a critic of Trump, but the problem is Trump himself changes his opinions on, or changes his emphasis on so many different things, and he is both promise and pitfall. I've never been actually that interested in criticizing Trump himself. I can talk about the psychology or my own frustrations with the whole thing, but Trump promised a bunch of stuff in 2016. He clearly was an unusual manager and governor and leader by the early part of the chaos of the first term. And there are all these different ways in which Trump has changed and maybe improved operationally, but it is still fundamentally a pretty zany guy running the country and running the party and running the movement that has its advantages and disadvantages. It's not 100% my style. It's not my style though. There are just limitations and benefits to that. As to the top lines, I think this is better than the Biden administration. I don't regret voting for him. Personally, the magazine doesn't make endorsements. I should be clear, but I'm happy to speak individually as a writer. And on the big ones, I'm very inclined to kind of give B minuses across the board, right? So no new wars, but man, we're really flirting with it. We really too close to it. The trade stuff, I think a lot of it was great, but it's been kind of unevenly executed and overly personalized, I would say. That all being said, wow, they did a lot of tariff policy, and the economy is actually not that bad. I mean, just again, inflation even lower as we record this today. The smart set really didn't say that would happen. And then, finally, immigration. Look, they shut the border down, which was an actual porous disgrace under Biden. But they're retreating from Minnesota right now, and the 2 people got killed in highly controversial circumstances. And I'm not even sure they really deported that many people in Minnesota. Again, the advantages and disadvantages. So B minus, I would really prefer if it was an A minus, but I really don't want it to be a D. If I had to grade a lot of the Biden stuff on those metrics, I would say immigration was a D minus. No new wars. I mean, Afghanistan, I think, was heroic by him, but everything else, Russia, Ukraine, disaster. So I'll give him a D plus on wars. And then on trade, I think he was actually kept a lot of Trump stuff. So I'll give him a B, but I think that averages out worse than Trump.
Well, with that, Mr. Mills, having given grades to both administrations, we can end. Just don't give a grade to this interview.
A minus.
All right. See ya.
Thanks, Peter.
Thanks for listening to the Trialogue Podcast. Make sure to subscribe to the show so you don't miss out on any episodes. The Trialogue Podcast is hosted by the Stimson Center and produced by University FM.